In the stark, unforgiving arena of a television courtroom, where the air crackles with the static of unresolved grievances and the quest for truth is presided over by the formidable and unflinching Judge Judy, a family's deepest fissures were about to be laid bare for the world to see. This was not merely a case about broken promises and unpaid debts. This was a gut-wrenching saga of a child caught in the crossfire of failed parenthood, a heartbreaking narrative of a boy named Richard, whose own life had become a bargaining chip in a game of adult irresponsibility. The central figure, the plaintiff, was a man named Fred, a grandfather whose weary eyes and heavy sighs spoke volumes of a burden shouldered not out of desire, but out of a desperate, last-ditch love for his 15-year-old grandson Richard. The air was thick with anticipation as Judge Judy, a paragon of sharp intellect and no-nonsense scrutiny, began to dissect the case, her gaze shifting between Fred, the determined patriarch, and his own son, the defendant, a man named Mark, who sat with a defensive posture that seemed to build a wall between himself and the painful accusations being leveled. The story began not in this courtroom, but in a moment of profound parental surrender, a phone call that would forever alter the trajectory of young Richard's life. Fred, with a voice laced with the gravel of disappointment and a father's heartache, recounted the fateful day his son Mark, and Mark's then-wife, a woman named Michelle, had called him and his wife. The words they uttered were not just an admission of failure, they were a chilling pronouncement. They claimed they could no longer control their own son, Richard. They painted a picture of a boy spiraling into darkness, becoming a street person, a phrase that conjured images of cold nights and hopeless days, a child dabbling in the dangerous allure of drugs and abandoning the structured sanctuary of school. The most devastating blow, the one that still echoed in Fred's mind with the force of a physical injury, was their cold, calculated decision. They were going to get rid of him, to discard their own flesh and blood by making him a ward of the state of California, casting him into the impersonal and often unforgiving machinery of the foster care system until he reached the age of 18. As a prelude to this abandonment, they had already institutionalized him, placing the troubled boy in a mental institution in Bellflower, California, a place meant for healing that, in this context, felt more like a holding cell before his final dismissal from their lives. It was from this bleak institution that Fred and his wife had retrieved their grandson, rescuing him from a fate they believed was tantamount to emotional annihilation. But Fred was a practical man, a man who understood the harsh mathematics of reality. He knew he could not single-handedly fund the reclamation of this broken young life. He needed help, a partnership in this rescue mission. And so, a deal was struck, a pact made not in shadowy secrecy, but, according to Fred, before the official stamp of a notary public. In that tense conversation, Mark and Michelle, the parents who were relinquishing their duties, had agreed to contribute $100 each per month to help support Richard. This was not a request for charity, it was a condition for the salvation of their son. Fred had looked his own child, Mark, in the eye and stated plainly that he could not afford to bear this financial weight alone. The agreement was sealed, the papers were signed, a tangible testament to a shared responsibility. Yet now, in this courtroom, those very papers were ghosts, vanished from Fred's files under mysterious circumstances he could not explain, leaving him with only the fragile memory of a promise and the bitter reality of its betrayal. What followed those first days of rescue was an 11-month marathon of love, patience, and relentless effort. Richard was a project of redemption, a boy whose education had been so thoroughly neglected that he was flunking the 7th grade, and had been absent from any formal schooling for 6 to 7 months. Fred, refusing to let his grandson become another statistic, embarked on a near-heroic campaign. He didn't just call the local school principal, he called the governor of Utah, pleading for intervention, for any lifeline that could pull Richard back from the academic abyss. This astonishing act of advocacy, a grandfather going to the highest office in the state for his grandson, eventually secured a tutor, a guide to help Richard navigate the summer and prepare for the 8th grade, to rebuild the shattered foundations of his future. The first chapter of Richard's life with his grandparents seemed to be reaching a stable, if tenuous, equilibrium. But then came Christmas, a time for family, which in this case became a catalyst for further chaos. A meeting was arranged at Numpue's, the opulent, dizzying Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, a surreal backdrop for a family drama of such gritty reality. There, Richard was to reacquaint himself with his father, Mark, who was now accompanied by a new wife. Fred, perhaps hoping for a Christmas miracle, a rekindling of the paternal bond, encouraged Mark to take Richard home with him for a week or two. It was an offer born of hope, but it quickly curdled into another abandonment. Just days later, Fred received a call from Mark, who announced with a finality that must have been chilling that he had decided to keep Richard. The choice of words was possessive, yet the action felt like another form of disposal. This new arrangement, however, was as fragile as glass. By January or February, the calls started again, this time from a frustrated and overwhelmed Mark. Richard was running away, ditching school if he was even enrolled. Mark seemed uncertain, a detail that spoke volumes about his engagement as a parent. The situation reached a terrifying climax when Mark reported that Richard had run away in nothing but his underwear or pajamas, a vulnerable child fleeing into the night, and it took his own father a full, agonizing week to locate him. This time, Richard did not return to the safety of his grandfather's home. Instead, he descended further into the system his grandfather had tried to save him from. He found himself in court, facing charges for 2 burglaries and other infractions, a boy now branded by the law, and in a move that must have felt like the ultimate betrayal to Fred, Mark, the father, the man who had promised support, formally petitioned the court to make Richard a ward of the state of California until he was 18. He was washing his hands of his son completely. It was then that the system, in a cruel twist, reached back out to Fred. Would he, they asked, take Richard back to Utah to save him from becoming a permanent ward of the state? The question was a moral sledgehammer. Of course, Fred did. He traveled, he collected his broken grandson from the wreckage of his son's failures, and he brought him back to Utah, resuming the arduous task of rehabilitation. He kept Richard until October, a period of relative stability that was shattered in the most violating way imaginable. According to Fred, Mark sneaked up and stole him. The word stole hung in the air, heavy with implication. Fred explained that while he and his wife were at work, Mark arrived with a sheriff in tow, using the authority of the law to physically take Richard away from the only home that had shown him consistent love and structure. The image was one of profound powerlessness. A grandfather receiving a frantic call from his daughter, learning that his son had used legal force to reclaim a child he had already legally abandoned. The case then took a sharp, unexpected turn, introducing a parallel narrative of trauma that seemed to compound the central financial dispute. The focus shifted to a different child, a boy named Dalton, who was also 15 years old. Dalton was not part of the original family conflict, but his story became a powerful, emotional counterpoint. He was the victim of a terrifying dog attack. The incident was not a simple nip, it was a vicious double bite that left both physical and deep psychological scars. The owner of the dog, a woman who was being sued for the incident, stood before Judge Judy, her posture a mix of regret and defensiveness. The details were harrowing. Dalton was still suffering from nightmares, diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition typically associated with soldiers returning from war, not a boy attacked by a family pet. He was undergoing ongoing treatment with a Dr. Kaplan, a testament to the profound emotional injury inflicted. Judge Judy, with her trademark precision, drilled into the details of the dog attack. The dog, after the incident, had been taken by animal control, held for a week for observation, and then, astonishingly, deemed not dangerous, and returned to the owner. The owner confirmed the dog's shots were up to date, but this did little to mitigate the horror of the event. In a poignant and revealing exchange, Judge Judy asked Dalton if he still had nightmares. His soft, hesitant, "Yes, ma'am," was a window into a world of recurring fear. She then asked if he had a dog in his own home at the time of the attack. He confirmed they had a greyhound, but in a heartbreaking decision born of his new instinctual fear, the family had been forced to return their own beloved pet to the rescue shelter about a month after the attack. The reason was a devastating chain reaction of trauma. Dalton, plagued by nightmares, would come into his parents' bedroom for comfort, but the greyhound, sleeping and dreaming, would growl if he came close, waking up and running away. The family moved the dog's bed to the computer room, but the problem persisted. The greyhound would growl when Dalton simply walked through the door. This was his own home, his sanctuary, and he was now afraid to enter a room in it. The family made the agonizing choice that him being afraid to come into his own house was not fair to him, and they sent their family dog away. This story served as a powerful metaphor for the case at large. Actions have consequences that ripple outward. destroying peace and forcing impossible choices. Judge Judy, synthesizing the two threads of the narrative, delivered her verdict with a tone of stern, unwavering finality. She acknowledged that the dog owner likely did not want the attack to happen, but that did not absolve her of responsibility. Her dog had caused not just physical injury, but substantial emotional injury to a child who was not about to forget a double dog bite. It was, she declared, the owner's responsibility to take care of it. She expressed dismay that the homeowner's insurance had not been properly utilized to resolve the matter, seeing it as a failure to follow through on the duty of care. She then rendered judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $5,000. The lesson from this painful, multi-layered drama is stark and universally applicable. Responsibility, once accepted, cannot be conveniently discarded when it becomes burdensome. A promise, whether it is a financial agreement to support a vulnerable child or the simple duty to control a family pet, carries moral and legal weight. When individuals, like the father Mark, shirk their fundamental duties, the collateral damage spreads far and wide, traumatizing children like Richard and forcing others, like the steadfast grandfather Fred, to bear burdens they should never have had to carry. Similarly, owning an animal is a contract of trust with the community, and a failure to uphold that trust can shatter a child's sense of safety and well-being, as it did for Dalton. The courtroom of Judge Judy laid bare the truth that evasion and broken promises create a web of pain, and ultimately, accountability is the only thread that can begin to mend what has been torn.